Thank you, thank you, thank you. That is such a wonderful song to start off the session with, and I hope we are all excited. A warm welcome to you all joining the session titled Reframing Taxation to Fulfill Women's Rights, a Feminist Taxation Framework. My name is Caroline Othim. I'm with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice as the Global Policy and Campaigns Coordinator Africa, and also a co-chair of the Tax and Gender Working Group. This session today is taking place as part of a global campaign on Make Taxes Work for Women, which was launched on the 15th of March and will run up to the 26th, and essentially will coincide with the CSW. And the CSW is a key strategic advocacy space for us to engage and to enter into dialogue with policymakers on tax issues affecting women, including on caring economy. The campaign is calling for multilateral institutions and national governments to, among others, reduce unfair tax burdens on women and adopt progressive, redistributive, and gender equal taxation. We invite you to join the campaign. Please feel free to visit the Global Alliance for Tax Justice website and social media pages for more information on how you can get involved. For today, our stellar lineup of speakers are going to present a bold new feminist taxation framework centering women's full participation and decision-making in line with CSW 65 priority theme. They will focus on a feminist tax framework with proposals to ensure that all tax systems tax women equally towards the realization of substantive gender equality. These is an obligation called for in various frameworks, including the International Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights, CEDAW, as well as the Beijing Platform for Action. So this is quite a timely discussion because the rollback on women's rights during the COVID-19 pandemic really will lose decades of hard-won progress towards increased gender equality. These perspectives on feminist tax systems will illuminate how fiscal space can be prioritized to fund policies, accelerate the attainment of gender equality. So we will hear of progress, of setbacks, and concrete actions to ensure that all fiscal systems are built around gender equal progressive tax regimes that support the full implementation of women's gender equality and other human rights. So why are we having this session today? We would like to engage and create a space for the women's rights movement and the tax justice movement within the CSW space to reflect on a feminist taxation framework leading to the achievement of gender equality. It is also an opportunity for us to present and reflect on a new and exciting publication on framing feminist taxation, which has been developed by the Global Alliance Tax and Gender Working Group and other partners. And towards the end of this session, please stay tuned for the launching of the publication. The publication highlights why a feminist tax framework is a way in which to create alternative and inclusive realities to ensure women's full participation and decision-making in public life. So who helped to put this event together? Quite a number of organizations, a list of 22, including, let me just mention them briefly, the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, Actionaid International, the Asia People's Movement on Debt and Development, Bretton Woods Project, Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, Center for Economic and Social Rights, Christian Aid, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, Feminist Legal Studies, Queen's University, Canada, FemNet, Forum for Women in Democracy, Gender and Development Network, Nawi Africa Collective, Oxfam International, Public Services International, Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, that's Siatini, Uganda, Shirakat Partnership for Development, Pakistan, Tax and Fiscal Justice Network, Tax Justice Network, Tax Justice Network Africa, Womankind Worldwide, and the Women's Working Group on FFD. So these are the organizations that helped put together the session and also contributed to the thinking through of the session itself. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the session. We will have interpretation in both Spanish and French. So please use the interpretation feature at the bottom of your screen so that you can change between English, Spanish, and French. Also, please kindly keep your mics on mute when you're not speaking on the floor. And lastly, there'll be a question and answer session towards the end. So please make note of any questions you may have for our speakers and feel free to post any comments on the chat box. The moderators will be able to keep track of those. At this point, let me introduce my co-chair, Rose, who will be able to moderate the panel session. So Rose Salbrink is the Policy and Advocacy Manager on Women's Economic Rights at Womankind Worldwide. And she's also a co-chair of the GATJ Tax and Gender Working Group, looking at the structural causes of women's economic inequality through a feminist analysis of the current global political economy. And she's also an advisory group member of Gender and Development Network in the UK. Previously, she was the World Bank Gender Project Lead and Communications Manager at the Bretton Woods Project, challenging the ways macroeconomic policies promoted by IFIs undermine gender equality in developing countries. She's also worked for women's organizations in Honduras. She's a feminist, an activist, and she's passionate about creating inclusive spaces to discuss women's rights. Over to you, Rose, now.
Thank you so much, Carol, and welcome everybody once again. For anybody that's just joined, there will be interpretation, so please select at the bottom English, French, or Spanish, because if you don't do that, then you won't be able to hear the translation in any languages. And as Carol already said, please share any questions in the chat that you have, and we will raise those later on today. And I also request that everybody that's not speaking to mute their videos and microphone, just to make sure that we have enough connectivity for everyone to join us today. We will have three short rounds of amazing people speaking on tax and gender justice from the wide global movement that we have. So I will be asking a round of questions. And first we will start with three amazing panelists from the different regional networks from GATJ. And I will introduce them first, and then each of them will answer a question in about 4 to 5 minutes. So firstly, we will have Jeannie Nakbil Manipon, who is currently with the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development and the Tax and Fiscal Justice Network Asia. Jeannie is a longtime activist for human rights and social justice and has worked on governance and is a gender specialist for international organizations based in Asia and as a senior lecturer on international politics and development studies in the Philippines. We are also joined by Chenai Mukumba, who is the Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at Tax Justice Network Africa. She is responsible for leading the policy unit in research coordination and policy engagement at regional and global levels, as well as providing the technical backstopping of TJNA's national level advocacy. She has expertise in international trade and Africa economic governance, with a wealth of experience in research coordination, policy advocacy, and leadership development. And last but not least, we have Veronica Serafini from the Red de Justicia Fiscal de América Latina y el Caribe. Veronica is a feminist economist and researcher on issues related to inequalities, gender, and fiscal policy. She's currently advisor at Latindad on gender issues. So I'm very honored to introduce these amazing people to you today. And first, we will start with Jeannie. And Jeannie how does the current tax system, how is it not feminist, and how does it undermine women's rights? And how does this play out in Asia Pacific? Thank you so much. You have about 4 to 5 minutes. The floor is yours. You are still on mute. Are you able to unmute yourself? Lace, are you able to unmute Jeannie for us? Lace, can you maybe also stop sharing the sound? Maybe that's another reason. Not sure.
Just a second.
No worries. Okay, maybe Lace and Jeannie, you can try and sort out Jeannie's microphone, and I will go on to Chenai to first answer the question so that we save some time. Chenai, the same question for you. How is the current tax system in your mind not feminist? How does it undermine women's rights? And how does it play out in Africa? Thank you so much.
Great. Can you hear me, Rose?
Yes, perfect. Very clear. Go ahead.
Awesome, no problem. First of all, thank you so much, everyone, for inviting us to sit on this panel. I'm so excited and so honored to be able to share this space with all of the incredible women that are talking today on this really important topic. So the question is, how is the current tax system not feminist, and how does it undermine women's rights? I work for Tax Justice Network Africa, so our primary area of focus and our work is within the African continent. At Tax Justice Network Africa, we of course believe in tax justice, and for us that includes ensuring that taxes are mobilized, resources are mobilized progressively, but also spent equitably, right? So when you're asking us to what extent do we think it's feminist, what we're trying to understand is that framework working in a feminist manner across the continent? And unfortunately, the answer to that is no. We feel that the current taxation system in Africa is not as feminist as it could be, and because of that, we find that a number of women are essentially contributing a larger component of the resources that they earn to national treasuries, but also when it comes to the expenditure side of things, we find that we don't see enough resources being spent on key social sectors that women are largely dependent on. So one of the things that was reported late last year by UNCTAD is that Africa is losing up to $89 billion on an annual basis. This is money that's leaving the continent. And this is money that's essentially leaving the continent primarily through corporate tax avoidance. And as a result, we're not obtaining as much as we should be, as much as we need to be from our natural resources, right? Because we've got corporates coming into the country, into the continent, investing, but then we don't see the resources that they generate staying within. They're finding their way outside of the continent. And so because of that, a lot of our tax revenue authorities end up using regressive tax regimes, right? So basically what you tend to find then is that the institutions, the individuals that earn the most are not paying the most. And you tend to find that those who earn the least and are most marginalized and vulnerable are the ones that are contributing larger components of their incomes, of their resources. And so, like I said, it ends up hitting women doubly because, you know, if you've got a regressive taxation system, it's the most marginalized that are hit, and within the African continent, and I think within largely the developing world, poverty, the most marginalized, has a female face. Across the African continent, you know, almost 70% of those who live in poverty are women. And so that's where you tend to find that there obviously facing the brunt of the resource mobilization side of the conversation, but then also you're not seeing the resources once they are mobilized being spent in key social sectors, because a lot of it is leaving the continent and not being spent in sectors that are primarily used by women. And the reason they're primarily used by women is because women don't have as much access to the formal labor market, right? And so they tend to be much more dependent on public services, right? They tend to be much more dependent on the education, on public education, public health, public social protection, right? And so when you ask me how feminist is the current taxation system, those are the ideas that come to mind. Those are the issues that I feel are so important for us to be thinking through and tackling. I was in a webinar earlier this morning that was being facilitated by ATAF, which is the African Tax Administration Forum. And one of the things that we were discussing was, even when you look at our African tax revenue authorities, tax administration, you don't see women in key decision making spaces. And so this is in a way also contributing to then what we find are tax systems that aren't centering and putting right at the core the needs of the most marginalized and the most vulnerable. So this is something that we need to address at a continental level. This is something that we need to be looking at. But more than anything, because I think within this forum, there was a discussion about how can we get more women in revenue authorities within tax administration, right? What I said was, more than that, what we need to make sure is that when we start to put women in these positions of power within tax authorities, they carry with them, the right ideologies, right? Because unfortunately, patriarchy is something that is perpetuated often by women as well, right? And so when we put women into those positions of authority, we need to also ensure that the ideology that's underpinning that revenue authority is also feminist in its thinking. So I think I'm going to wrap up over there, Royce, and then happy to answer any questions. But I think, like I said, in the long and short, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the African continent to make it a just feminist economy. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chenai, for sharing your experience with us today. And we will come back to others at the end of the session with a further question. But as you will be leaving us a little bit sooner today, I was wondering if you wanted to answer now one action or change to move towards a feminist taxation framework and why this is key for women's rights, just in about a minute or so. You're on mute still.
Sorry, you'd think after almost a year of using Zoom, we would know by now how to not unmute. I think, like I said, we need to be intentional about putting, number one, women into positions of power, right, when we're looking at our tax systems. But that's at the very basic level. Within the African continent, it's paltry, the number of women that we have, particularly in senior executive positions in tax authorities, right? But that's what I would say is the starting point. Once we kind of get that right, what we also just need to make sure is that our tax systems themselves are feminist, which as far as I'm concerned, and I think is something that is held quite dearly by women that are working on feminist taxation issues, is that you're putting women right at the center of the entire tax system. You're putting the poor, the marginalized at the center of the tax system, right? And ensuring that ultimately at the end of the day, it's people-centered, right? Rather than corporate-centered, which unfortunately is how many of our tax systems across the continent are looking. So there's that, in terms of what we need to do to make it much more feminist. But in addition to that, like I mentioned earlier, Africa as a continent is losing significant amounts of money. We need to plug those loopholes. And you plug those loopholes at two levels, right? At a national level, of course, we need to put in place the measures that we need by enhancing capacity of our tax revenue authorities, and also see the extent to which we can address issues such as corruption. But much more importantly, and this is something we work on at TJNA, is that at the end of the day, this money is leaving the continent and going somewhere else, right? So we need a global solution to addressing the issue of illicit financial flows. At the end of the day, countries that are outside of the continent are complicit in the money that's leaving the continent and in the money that's therefore not being able to be reinvested and plowed back into our economies, into sectors that are essential for women in order for them to live, productive and dignified lives. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. Yes. So let's stop illicit financial flows and obviously have women at the center of the tax system. Thank you so much, Chenai, for your contribution. I will now move to Veronica with the same question. How do you think the current tax system is not feminist, and how does it undermine women's rights? As well as how does this play out in Latin America? And you have about 4 minutes. Thank you so much.
Gracias, Ros. Y muy en coincidencia con lo que decía Chenai, América Latina no es diferente a otras regiones y se agrega el hecho de ser una de las regiones o la región más desigual del mundo. Esa desigualdad no es solamente de ingresos, sino también entre hombres y mujeres y dentro de las propias mujeres. Y el sistema tributario efectivamente contribuye a mantener esas desigualdades, sobre todo, y lo que nos toca hoy en este espacio es hablar del sistema tributario, que tiene un impacto obviamente en lo que decía Chenai del gasto. Sin recursos no hay políticas de salud, de educación, de protección social, de empleo, de agricultura familiar, que necesitan las mujeres para reducir las brechas con los hombres y entre las propias mujeres. Y la política tributaria y el sistema tributario tiene varias vías en América Latina que impide que podamos hablar de un sistema tributario feminista. Uno de ellos es el peso tan importante que tienen los impuestos indirectos. En América Latina, alrededor del 60% de los impuestos que se recaudan son indirectos y en algunos países llega incluso a tener mayor peso. Esto hace, al tener un peso tan alto los impuestos indirectos, lo que hace es que, lo que estamos diciendo es que el impuesto al valor agregado a los bienes y servicios son muy importantes y son justamente aquellos bienes y servicios que más consumen las mujeres. Y terminan pagando, y son las que están en la base de la pirámide social. Por lo tanto, son las que por un lado terminan pagando muchos impuestos indirectos y por otro lado tienen eso afecta a la distribución del tiempo en los hogares, porque cuando faltan recursos, lo que tienen que hacer las mujeres es equilibrar esa falta de recursos con más trabajo dentro de los hogares. Entonces, el no contar, el tener que destinar recursos a impuestos indirectos, también tiene sus efectos en la división sexual del trabajo. El otro, al no existir, al tener tanto peso los impuestos indirectos, la contrapartida obviamente es que los impuestos directos son bajos. Los impuestos a la renta, el impuesto al patrimonio, los impuestos a las riquezas en América Latina o no existen o tienen un bajo peso. Y justamente ahí es donde están sobrerepresentados los hombres, mientras que las mujeres están sobrerepresentadas en las poblaciones de menores ingresos o de mayor pobreza. Por eso hablamos de feminización de la pobreza. Otra de las vías que tiene América Latina son los privilegios tributarios que afectan, por ejemplo, a la inversión extranjera directa. Tenemos lo que llamamos una carrera a la baja en términos impositivos para la inversión extranjera directa, priorizando menores impuestos para el capital y para el capital generalmente extranjero, que suelen ser empresas grandes que además vuelven a trasladar esos recursos hacia sus beneficios hacia el exterior. Esos privilegios no tienen los sectores donde están sobre representadas las mujeres, por ejemplo, la agricultura familiar y las pequeñas y medianas empresas. Entonces hay también un desbalance en las medidas tributarias dirigidas a las grandes empresas o al capital y a las pequeñas o medianas empresas o los impuestos al trabajo. Cuando las grandes corporaciones no pagan impuestos, ¿quiénes terminan pagando los impuestos? La ciudadanía en los países. Y sobre todo el trabajador. Y cuando los impuestos son indirectos, peor todavía termina pagando el consumidor, la consumidora o las mujeres que equilibran los ingresos en el hogar. Y finalmente otra vía que ya habló Chenai es el de los flujos financieros ilícitos, que está relacionado en parte con la inversión extranjera directa, pero tiene una dinámica propia. Y en América Latina hay básicamente dos vías. En los países andinos, por ejemplo, pesa mucho la minería, el extractivismo, y en los países del cono sur, la producción y la exportación de soja. Ahí hay una planificación tributaria agresiva de las grandes corporaciones que permiten, donde los países no tienen suficiente fuerza, no tienen suficientes medidas para reducir la evasión o la elusión de impuestos que implican estas corporaciones. Y como bien dijo Chenai, cuando hay evasión y cuando hay bajas recaudaciones, se reduce la posibilidad del Estado de financiar políticas para las mujeres. Y bueno, ahí tenemos recientemente
Por
el
favor,
informe
Verónica,
final del panel
¿puedes
FACTI.
completar su contribución en un minuto?
Ya.
Gracias.
Ya termino. Estos 3 o 4 aspectos son los que caracterizan la política tributaria latinoamericana y las que generan o no contribuyen a las desigualdades. Y entre esas desigualdades, obviamente, están las de género. Ahí. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Verónica. Unfortunately, Jeannie has not been able to rejoin us, so hopefully she will be able to join still during the session and share her contributions from the Asia and Pacific region of the GACH network. But for now, we shall move on to our next round of 2 speakers, which I'll introduce, and then I will ask the questions again. Firstly, we will have Wangari Kinoti, who is a feminist activist currently engaged in global policy advocacy on women's economic justice and structural gender-based violence. She is the International Policy Advisor for Women's Rights at Actionaid International. And over the last 17 years, she has campaigned and implemented programs with civil society and social justice organizations covering women's political participation, women's land and natural resource rights, corporate accountability, women's paid and unpaid labor, and structural violence against women. She's also currently working with the African feminist activists to document histories of feminist organizing on the continent. Second, we will have Melo, who is the World Women's Committee member for Public Services International. She's also the secretary of the working group at SINDEP, which is the Union of Municipal Workers in Sao Paulo. And she is a part of the feminist movement of Brazil Women. So very welcome to both. Firstly, I have a question for Wangari, who has informed me her internet connection isn't great today, so she might not be able to share her video. Wangari, so over to you. How have governments and international financial institutions' responses to COVID impacted women's rights? And secondly, what do you think needs to change to create feminist economies? No smart questions, but please, in about 4 to 5 minutes, we would really love to hear your thoughts. Over to you.
Thanks, Rose. I did have my video on earlier, but I've had to turn it off and hopefully the connection will hold. Thanks to you, and thanks for everyone for joining. Thanks to everyone for joining this call. Indeed, they're quite wide questions, but I will just, sort of give some examples to perhaps surface, some of the issues, and many of these have already been mentioned by the colleagues who have spoken before me. On the question of, COVID, government and IFI responses to COVID and their impact on women's rights, I think, we have to think a little bit first about perhaps what it is that governments ought to have been responding to. So I'll draw an example from one of our projects and a report that we produced. So basically, Actionaid has been working with young women in urban areas, mostly in informal settlements, in India, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, through a project that we call Young Urban Women Life Choices and Livelihoods Program. And we've been doing this since 2013. We work with approximately 10,000 young women across 19 cities in those 4 countries. So in August last year, we interviewed about 1,200 of these young women in 22 informal settlements across 14 cities in these 4 countries. And just to give you a picture, 80% of the young women we talked to were aged between 18 and 30, 43% were employed or earning an income, 15.7% were in the formal sector. The rest, so 84.3% were in the informal sector, either as daily wage earners, contractual workers, or domestic workers. 93.2% of them had received some form of formal education. And, perhaps predictably, our primary question to them was, what is the impact of COVID-19 on your lives and those of, other young women living in your urban informal settlement or in your area where you live? So we can share the full report, obviously, on this, but the super summary is that 35% were unable to continue engaging in their regular paid work, meaning that their incomes reduced or disappeared completely. 65% reported that the cost of food and other consumables increased, particularly during the lockdown period. 52% had not received any government benefits or other forms of social protection, 52%, so more than half. 71% reported that they had increased household work. 58% felt that they or other women and girls had become more vulnerable to violence during the period. And lastly, 76% reported that they didn't have, or that access to public services had been hampered due to the pandemic. Okay, so that's sort of an overview, a quick overview of what some of the major issues were, resulting from the pandemic. Meanwhile, if you look at government intervention, so let's look at Africa region alone, because I know we don't have much time. As of end of September 2020, a total of 45 countries in Africa, I'm talking about Africa south of the Sahara, had adopted 189 social protection and labor market measures in response to COVID-19. So that's a lot of countries, 45%, 189 different kind of measures, but only 16% of these measures are considered to be gender sensitive. I'm using the term used by the UNDP, UN Women Tracker. I know that we prefer, terms like gender responsive and so on, but I'm reporting on what's on the tracker. So only 16% of these measures, and only 19% of the total of
Wangari, you're cutting out a little
that 31
bit for
countries
me.
adopt.
So do you mind repeating the last sentence again, and maybe wrapping up in a few minutes as well? You were cutting out a little bit. I don't know if it's just me, but thank you.
Okay, so I was basically saying that there has been a very I won't maybe repeat all that, because the main point I'm trying to make here is that there has been really a very poor sort of global showing when it comes to, you know, economic stimulus, fiscal or monetary policy measures taken by governments that respond to, you know, to gender inequalities, and out addressing unpaid care and domestic work, which actually have performed the least globally. So only 2% of all measures taken in Africa look at unpaid care and domestic work, and the figure is 8% globally. And then moving on to IFIs, in Africa, you know, you had the IMF classifying 9 out of 33 countries as being at high risk of debt distress. At the same time, I've talked about the economic stimulus packages, you know, across Africa, south of the Sahara, but generally speaking, only 3% of, the fiscal packages or economic stimulus amounted to only 3% of GDP across the region, compared to 27% in G20 countries. And that's obviously generally significant. But if you look, for example, at South Africa, you know, and I pick out South Africa because South Africa had the highest amount, you know, their spending on fiscal stimulus or economic stimulus more generally was 10% of GDP, so highest in Africa. But yet, you know, they are at the moment, you know, going through a process of the IMF cautioning them against, you know, a large fiscal deficit. And the advice is what we've come to expect: wage bill containment, avoiding subsidies, transferring state-owned, creating conditions to increase private investment, redefining the role of public sector, increasing labor market flexibility, all those things that we've now become quite familiar with. Yet, as been highlighted by many on the panel, indeed the 2 speakers before me, we know that this kind of advice is what has led to the poor delivery of social protection, to privatization and commodification of public goods and services, and precarious labor conditions, etc. You asked me a whole other question. Your camera has come on, so I'm sure you're trying to tell me to wind up. Would you like me to answer the other question?
Yes, if you wouldn't mind, sort of in a minute or a minute and a half, just what do you think needs to change to create feminist economies from where we are now? Maybe highlight one thing or something like that. Thank you so much.
All right. So the one thing, I think here we're talking about really creating a just, you know, a feminist, just and green future. So we have to look at all that together. And it's really about reorganizing, you know, the economy, society, politics, and all that, completely dismantling what isn't working because it's not working. And then putting care at the center of everything, of the economy, of society, of politics, of life. And that includes reinstating the social contract between, you know, international institutions, states, and the people, yeah? So that includes massively scaling up investment in public infrastructure and jobs. It also means transforming global governance rules. We have to rebalance, you know, what is ongoing, but is, you know, an equal power relation, you know, unsustainable debt burdens from the global south. And then, you know, so strengthening local markets, ensuring labor and environmental standards are applying across them. And then, of course, you know, ensuring that there is an international progressive, green, and feminist tax system, including an international tax authority. So I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wangari. And we did get some messages that some of your contribution cut out a little bit, but hopefully people were able to hear sufficient Wangari's wonderful contributions. I will now go over to Melo, with the question, how has physical space impacted the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action in Brazil? And how do you think human rights could be guaranteed? Thank you so much, Luba. The floor is yours. I think Luba cannot hear. You can hear now? Can the interpreters hear Luba? Lais, any thoughts?
Luba, just try to include as co-host. If you can check your mic settings, please. Luba, desculpa, se você puder, a gente não te escuta. Rose, do you want to...
I will move on to the next question whilst you can hopefully resolve this. I'm so sorry about this. Our next three speakers will focus on women's political participation and how to influence fiscal policy.
¿Escucho?
Oh, there we go. Yes, I can hear you.
¿Escucho o no?
Sí.
Sí, agora sim.
Perdão, meu perdão. Companheiras, está ok? Ok. Olá, muchas gracias a todas y todos. Primero es necesario entender lo que sí, está... Ros, la pregunta o no?
Of course, no worries. So how has fiscal space impacted the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action in Brazil? And how do you think human rights can be guaranteed? Feel free to respond to whatever you feel comfortable with. You have about 4 to 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
Gracias, perdón, problema de micrófono. Olá, muchas gracias a todos, a todas. Primero es necesario entender lo que se sucedió en Brasil en los últimos 5 años. Brasil ha experimentado muchos contratiempos a partir del golpe de 2016 que destituyó Dilma Rousseff da presidencia. Tuvimos varios ataques a la población, con fuerte impacto de género. Como ejemplo, tenemos la reforma laboral. Hoy tenemos 13 millones y medio de desempleados y su mayoría son mujeres. También tenemos a ley que reduce gastos públicos. Tivemos redução principalmente com a saúde e educação. Exemplo é o Sistema Único de Saúde, SUS. Em 2019, perdeu 20 milhões. Outro exemplo é a reforma das pensões, teve forte impacto na vida das mulheres. Com a reforma, as mulheres trabalham mais anos. Exemplo, em setor urbano, más 2 años. En sector rural, las mujeres trabajan más 5 años. Este año estamos luchando para que no ocurra la reforma administrativa que afectará los servicios públicos. En 2018, con la elección de Bolsonaro, agravóse más la crisis política y económica, con varios cortes en las políticas de géneros. Hablamos que Bolsonaro es un genocida en poder. Y por delante del Ministerio de la Mujer, la Familia y los Derechos Humanos, tenemos Damares Alves, una ultraconservadora con inmensos retrocesos en los derechos sexuales y reproductivos. laborales, sociales de las mujeres. Brasil, hoje, em 2021, também é o pior país em la luta contra o Covid. Com respeito à área fiscal, podemos dizer que a estrutura fiscal em Brasil é regressiva e prejudica os mais pobres, especialmente as mulheres. Quanto mais pobres o indivíduo, mais impostos paga com relação ao dinheiro que conta para sobreviver. Em Brasil, os ricos quase não pagam impostos sobre grandes alqueires, grandes ativos. E as políticas da plataforma de Beijing estão subfinanciadas em Brasil. Comparando as quantidades gastadas com as políticas para as mulheres relacionadas com a Agenda 2030, as que se gastam com incentivos com alguns sectores, como os pesticidas, um exemplo, a quantidade que o Brasil no arrecadou com a isenção para as plaguicidas é enormemente maior para as políticas de gênero. As empresas, é um exemplo muito sério, as empresas agrotóxicas recebem exceções fiscais de 10 milhões por ano. A quantidade que o governo federal e os estados não arrecadam da isenção fiscal a los pesticidas é mais que o doble de lo que gasta com a saúde, que gastou com a saúde em 2017, com pacientes com câncer, 4,7 milhões. Outros dados muito importantes. Em ano em que o país registrou dos índices mais altos de violência das mulheres, o gasto com ações de proteção às mulheres realizado pelo Ministério da Mulher, da Família e Direitos Humanos em 2020 foi mais baixo em los últimos 10 anos. É decir, companheiras, se lo certo é que a implementação da plataforma de Beijing em este cenário teve impacto quase nulo no espaço fiscal do Brasil, com respeito aos direitos das mulheres. Que observamos que hemos hecho progressos em governo de Dilma hasta 2016, pero a produção de cambios reais e avançados em la vida de las niñas e de las mulheres ha sido demasiado lento em Brasil. Estamos lejos de lograr a igualdade de gênero, múltiplos obstáculos legais, culturais permanecem sem cambios. Como resultado, as mulheres brasileiras seguem trabalhando, mas ganhando menos, têm menos opções, experimentam múltiplas formas de violências em espaços públicos, em suas casas. Em nossa luta feminista é que o espaço fiscal do Brasil se vá mais afetado pela plataforma de Beijing. Brasil necessita mais investir em políticas de gênero, em políticas públicas, e necessita ter melhores ingressos, uma revisão dos privilégios fiscais e tudo mais, e fora Bolsonaro. Muitas graças, companheira, me perdoam o problema técnico. Graças.
Thank you so much, Luba, and no worries about the technical issues. We all have them. I'm very glad that you are able to join us today, and absolutely shocking what you have said about the pesticides receiving twice as much as the health budget during global pandemic, and some of the other things that you've set out. So thank you again so much for sharing that with us today. As I said before, at the end of the session, we will ask all the panelists another question to wrap up in 1 minute. But first, we will move to the last 3 panelists, focus on women's political participation and the chance to influence fiscal policy. In the meantime, please share any questions in the chat for all the speakers, and Caroline will moderate a few of those questions after this last round of speakers. I will introduce first the speakers and then go with a question to each of them. So we will be joined by Elizabeth Ampire, who is a gender and rights activist, civil society project management consultant, and an advisor with 14 years of professional experience. She is currently the director of programs with Forward in Uganda, and she provides programmatic oversight and champions advocacy on women's rights, including steering work with collaborative alliances in the national, regional, and global levels. She is also an active mentor for young women and is very passionate about advancing the women's agenda in the SDGs to ensure that no woman and girl is left behind by 2030. We will also have Nicole Maloba, who is the Economic Justice Officer at Feminist, and working on diverse thematic issues on women's economic justice and rights within Africa. Her main focus is on feminist trade policy, extractives, fiscal policy, tax, and illicit financial flows. And then we also have Bilkis Tahira, who is the executive director of Shirakat in Pakistan. She is a feminist activist, having over 20 years of experience of working with the government, NGOs, the UN, donors on social development issues, economic justice, tax justice, and gender justice. I'm very honored to be able to tap into the wealth of experience of these three people. So first we will go to Elizabeth Ampire. How is women's participation hindered, and what needs to change to influence fiscal policy or create a feminist tax system? The floor is yours.
Hi, Rosie. Thank you very much for this opportunity. As Forward, we are very excited to be part of this conversation. We know that promoting women's leadership is actually foundational to Forward's work. We prioritize getting more women in elective office, supporting legislators to navigate the political landscape and to elevate their impact in leadership. So the key hindrances, I'll just point out three major ones. One is about the question of numbers. Currently, we stand at 34% in the national parliament. That is, currently, the representation of women in the national parliament stands at 34%. And most of these are actually on affirmative action. And we recognize that this number is insufficient to be able to influence fiscal policy, but also push for a feminist tax system. And then the other issue is around the quality of representation. You know, much as we have these low numbers, the women that are there have inadequate capacities to debate, to comprehend issues around fiscal policy. They have inadequate evidence to support their arguments. And also this stems from their being delinked from the women's movement. So this all culminates into a lack of a unified voice for them to be able to push for the gender responsive taxes that we actually are pushing for. So I had shared two visuals earlier with you, Rosie. Could you please share them?
Yes, just a minute. Apologies, there was someone knocking on my windows.
And then as we wait upon Rosie, the third one is around the environmental factors that have been talked about by earlier speakers, issues to do with patriarchy, violence against women in elections, insensitive reporting by the media about women's leadership, and all of these affect their confidence and self-esteem for them to be able to push for legislative change that actually encompasses women's issues. Okay, so on the screen, I hope we are all able to tap into what is on the screen. This is just depicting how the first circle that we have on the extreme left shows the number of women that are in leadership at the district local government, that is 37%. And then when we look at the arms of government, executive, judiciary, legislature, 14%, cabinet, only 31%, and then parliament and legislative committees, that is 37%. And this data is based on a study that we did as Forum for Women in Democracy in 2018. And the purpose of this visual is actually to demonstrate how women influence fiscal policy, that includes budgets, taxes, public expenditure, by participating in legislative committees and district councils. And you see the numbers right there in the pink box. So we cannot talk about, women influencing if the numbers are actually missing. This is just an emphasis of that. Rosie, could you please move to the next one? So I would like to share with you a success story from Uganda on gender responsive budgeting, which work Forward commenced in 1997. So Forward started this advocacy in 1997, and just to walk you through the journey, in 2000, we had a publication on on the gender budget analysis of the 1998-99 budgets for education, health, and agriculture sectors. And then in 2004, for the first time, we saw the Ministry of Finance issuing a budget call circular with gender responsive budget requirements. So we saw the needs of women and girls, men, boys feature in the budget. Initially, it was just neutral budgeting without necessarily considering the needs of the various categories of people. And then we saw a major breakthrough in 2005, which saw the adoption of the gender and equity guidelines by the Ministry of Finance, which were attached and distributed with the budget call circular, mandating all sectors, and this is all sectors both at national and at local level, district level, sub-county level, they were all mandated to ensure that gender and equity issues are actually integrated in the budget framework papers. For us, and then of course the climax of this is in 2015, where we saw the enactment of the Public Finance Management Act that put in place a requirement for a certificate of gender and equity to be issued against all ministries, departments, and agencies before their budgets could actually be approved. So this is a clear demonstration of what women can achieve once they are effectively participating in decision-making processes. So as I wind up, there are three takeaway messages. As we wind up, there are three takeaway messages for us as Forward, where we want to really put our emphasis and call for advocacy collectively as a women's rights movement, but also amplifying our voices in the global spaces. One is that we need to really advocate for women to move beyond the affirmative seats to get into the mainstream seats if we are to actually attain parity at the end of the day, because we cannot work with the 34% to effectively influence policy, fiscal policy, but also feminize the tax system. And then the other thing is about enhancing capacity development for the women that are already there. Those that are on affirmative action, those that are in the various leadership spaces, how do we enhance their capacities on these physical policies for them to ably debate and comprehend and push their voices through to ensure that these are given their due attention. And then the third issue, just like we demonstrated that gender responsive budgeting has worked for Uganda, we believe this is a model that can cut across the women's rights movement, not just in Africa, but beyond, such that we have budgets that actually recognize the priorities for women, for girls, because that is the only way we are going to have taxes that actually work for women. Because we know that most women actually depend on public resources more than the men. So we need to actually see that there is increased investment in the public sector that is gender responsive. Then lastly, we need to strengthen coalitions. I'm happy that this conversation is happening. We are part of the Global Tax Justice Alliance. We are also part of CIATINI. And such that we have a collective voice, not just at national level, but also at the regional and global level. Because as we do all this work, we need to continually fight issues like corruption. We need to ensure that there is gender responsive service delivery and ensure that taxes actually work for women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was really amazing. Now we will go to Nicole. Please, the floor is yours, Nicole, to answer the question. What do you think needs to change to influence fiscal policy and create a feminist tax system?
So, hi, thanks a lot, Rose. Unfortunately, my internet service provider is failing me, so I just wanted to turn on my camera so that everyone could see my face. I will turn it off so that I could present, and then I will turn it back on at the end. Yeah.
Sounds good. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you once again for allowing us as Feminist to come on board and just be able to share our 2 cents on women's engagement with fiscal policy. I won't delve too deep into statistics because from Chenai, Wangari, as well as Forwarder has just shared with us in terms of statistics. I'll just delve deep into some of the thoughts around fiscal policy and how women can become more tactful and vocal within that space. So within most of our work as Femnet, economic justice and rights, actually one of the main challenges we've seen, which actually needs to change in order to influence feminist fiscal progression, is the lack of political will. We tend to see that political will is actually a significant driver in achieving gender just and transformative fiscal policies. And there needs to be some clear indicators of commitment of governments to actually want to do this and to progress towards this. Otherwise, we're just, playing a catapult game here, and we're not going to be able to have any tangible results. So we need to have clear indicators for commitments to show that these governments want, to correct the current established practices in policy, to innovations that are actually, promoting institutional reforms, which are in line with the SDGs, which is actually, in our present case, development enabled by women for women. So we can delve into, the disproportionate tax burden on women from, regressive forms of revenue generation, and we can also look at the tax revenue losses, which actually aggravate inequality, and I could get into that, but as you know, we have a lot of broadness when it comes to illicit financial flows and how that affects women's rights within the economic justice and rights space. But one thing also that I would really like to highlight on is Forwarder did mention that gender budgeting has worked for Uganda, and we have also been privy to read some of the research on how gender budgeting is working for a lot of countries, India included as well, from that perspective, Uganda. But one of the things we're really trying to advocate for is that we need to have clear legal status for gender budgeting. So over and above it being sort of, some countries are, trying it with a one-off scenario, it works then we don't actually have it laid down on constitutions. You find that it's becoming a one-off thing, and it's not actually transitioning into becoming something which is really sustainable. So to be able to provide gender budgeting within the legal status, we're able to ensure that there's, sustainability and continuity, so that even when countries are changing within different political scenarios, this doesn't change. We've seen countries like Rwanda, which has actually mandated gender budgeting in its constitution. So that gives us, lack of a better term to use, some form of cushioning for women to know ahead that this is where we're at. So a legal status would also be crucial in terms of, a change towards influencing fiscal policy. The other thing is that, of course, we talk about how women have to be able to engage within tax administration, but generally, we need to be able to promote diverse women's leadership and meaningful participation at all levels when it comes to economic policy, planning, reform, stimulus, you name it. We've seen also in terms of a research I was actually privy to before yesterday when I was attending a different webinar, and how research shows that if women were, theoretically have economic parity by 2025, it would boost the global GDP, by 28 trillion USD. This alone shows you how much women need to be at the forefront of any sort of development, especially economic, development. So it's so crucial to promote diverse women's leadership and meaningful participation. And this is not only limited to women's rights groups, for example, in civil society. They also have to have an equal voice in decisions which are made at local levels, national levels, in regards to financing, infrastructure and investments. We also try and push that gender units within government departments should have access to adequate financial resources to implement specific plans and programs that benefit women and girls, especially those that are most likely to experience multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination due to identity-based factors. I think from everything we can see that to be able to have a feminist tax system or feminist fiscal policies moving forward, it's a collaborative effort. And we, as much as we have and want to leverage, of course, the way governments have to be on board, states have to be on board, IFIs have to be on board, civil society have to be on board, but most importantly, the citizens. And in this case, we're talking about women have to be on board. And one of the other things which we also really tend to advocate for within FemNetwork, and we're also working currently with how to use the Fair Tax Monitor with a gender lens to be able to advocate and have accountability in terms of revenue generation and spending policies which better respond to women's and girls' needs. So fiscal literacy, to be honest, is something that we've seen is actually very crucial. You find that when it comes to education, generally 2/3 of the 750 million illiterate adults worldwide are women. So that means a third are only men. And that just shows you how, in terms of knowledge generation, women are still lagging behind. And of course, fiscal literacy being part of the literacy levels is also key in terms of us to be able to move forward, to have much developed economic systems. So one thing, like I always try to say, and I think it's so important because we've seen that there's lack of political will, and that's one of the main issues as to why we're not where we need to be. And we've seen that feminist economists have come on board. If it's an analysis, we've done it. If it's an analytical framework, here we are, we've done it. We're actually doing the work for most of these states, and they just don't want to really put us at the front line. They don't want to consider us. They don't want to promote us. They don't want to put us forward in terms of any considerations when they're making policies or even taking loans from IFIs. So we have to be able to vernacularize this language of tax within the women. And this is women from all spheres. You know, tax is considered this technical and structural thing, which is complicated. And
sorry, Nicole, do you mind wrapping up
yes,
shortly?
Yeah,
Thank you,
and that's made us, because it's considered technical, it's made this sort of, you know, systemic exclusion on creating of the critical voices of women being excluded. So I think it's so important for us to unpack and present complex, you know, public finance information of taxation and public spending in easy to understand languages. And I think even I saw someone on the chat box saying, could you please explain this and whatnot? Women want to learn, women want to engage, we want to know, we want to go to the shop and be able to be like, hey, did you see what the government said? Yeah, do you know what that means for us? Does that mean fuel costs are coming high? What does that mean for VAT? Women want to engage. So I think it's so crucial, over and above us targeting governments, targeting private sector, targeting tax institutions. We need to go down and we need to vernacularize this thing. It needs to be a norm, a social, a way of just engaging with tax so that women can hold people accountable in terms of policy and capacity improvements. So I think I'll just stop there. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nicole. We heard you loud and clear. Political will is a key barrier, and women want to learn, but the systemic exclusion and around fiscal policy and fiscal literacy very clearly set out. Thank you so much. I will now move to Bilkis Tahira to answer the same question. How is women's participation hindered, and what needs to change to influence fiscal policy and create a feminist tax system? Over to you, Bilkis.
Thank you, Ruth. It's so exciting to be in this space because so many things that, you know, seem to resonate with the situation in Pakistan as well. And, you know, I agree with everyone that to get anywhere near influencing fiscal processes, budget making, or arguing for a women-sensitive taxation framework, women, to begin with, have to be part of a political process, in particular at the leadership level. I'll just take 1 minute each to look at what are the main issues, main barriers for women to be voters. So really the first one is that there's very there's no interest in a patriarchal society to register women at birth, register girls at birth. And then that continues because at the moment, almost over 30% women in Pakistan do not have their national identity cards, which means they cannot be registered as voters. Then our National Registration Authority has been trying to support that process, sending mobile vans across to rural areas. However, their budget is limited, the people are limited, the internet facilities that they need in the field are limited. So the registration process, which has been supported by women, but also women's groups and other NGOs, but also the government, doesn't work very well. So they cannot be, once they are included as voters, they don't have individual choice. They have to go by what the family is saying they should do. They have to listen to the people in the family who tell them, particularly men, who tell them who to vote for. So that's another issue. And so the choice there also becomes very, very limited. So these are really two main issues for women voters. And then we have seen in a number of cases, the faith leaders have not been very supportive of women voting, and in several areas in the previous elections, also in the election before that, 2013 and 2018, in a number of areas, faith leaders got together and banned women from voting. So what the government has done now is, if in a constituency, there aren't 10% of women voting, then the election will be held null and void. On the other hand, to be for women parliamentarians, currently we have about 20% or 1/5 of the total combined membership of both houses of parliament in Pakistan. At the same time, they've been very active and they contribute 33% or 1/3 to the parliamentary business. Actually, sadly then, not many of their suggestions get to the next level of adoption or implementation, although some of it does. And the average attendance of parliamentary sessions, according to a research done by Free and Fair Election Network, has been in each house is significantly higher than their male counterparts. And the same is true at the local level, where social audit, one was done by CIAT, has evidence that the constituents expressed greater satisfaction with the performance of women councillors than that of male councillors. However, a number of structural challenges that have been mentioned already. And it's, I mean, I hear those barriers and I say, oh, you could, same issues in Pakistan as well, both social and political level, and that limit women's parliamentarians' effectiveness. Foremost challenge is, politics. Number one, politics is considered a man's domain. So women are explicitly often and implicitly discouraged from taking part, since politics is thought of to be a dirty business. And particularly in Pakistan, where women are, the so-called repository of honor for the family. So political ambitions for women are really, discouraged right from the beginning. And in terms of if they, cross the initial barriers to active political participation through her own determination or a rare encouraging environment, her success is in electoral politics is rendered limited by short-term political pragmatism and unfavorable social attitudes. So these
do you mind wrapping up?
Okay.
We have about a minute left. Thank you.
Okay. So in terms of Okay, now coming to why they cannot influence the fiscal policy, because women parliamentarians also think of economics as a mystery. They really don't understand it. In no, parliamentary committee which deals with either debt or, fiscal or budgetary issues, women are not represented there at all. So there's, and women don't want to be represented as well because they feel that this is an alien subject for them. So I'll stop here and maybe later, we can talk more about strategies. Over to you, Rusi.
Thank you so much, Bilkis, for joining us and sharing that with us. I am hoping that we now have Jeannie able to speak and share her contribution before we go over to some questions with Carol. So just to go back to the question that we have for Jeannie, who will be answering towards how the current tax system is not feminist. How does it undermine women's rights? Of course, we've already heard some of this today, and specifically, how does this play out in the Asia Pacific? Jeannie, I cross my fingers. I hope you can. Yes, go ahead. You have about 4 to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Hear me now?
You're cutting out a little bit, but I can hear you.
Rose, can you hear me? Can you all hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh no!
With a bit of cutting out, but not. Please try and go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, space. I don't need it. What happened because okay, let me try to get better reset. Okay. I will not repeat the whole class because the situation of women in Asia.
I'm afraid I can't hear you at the moment, Jeannie. Lais, are you able to hear Jeannie?
No, not really. I think she's actually out of the room, Rose.
Oh, maybe I'm so sorry. We're very sorry that we're not able to have a good connection with Jeannie, and we will hope to share with you afterwards some of her thoughts, hopefully on a blog. So I will hand over back to Carol for the future sessions of today. As we have heard from women around the world about the grave tax injustices and how this impacts women's rights. So what can we do next? Over to Carol.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you for that very informative and insightful panel session. I'd want to highlight some of the comments that were coming through the chat box, and also I think 1 or 2 questions to the panelists. So there's a comment that in response to Chenai's presentation, that once women get to power positions in tax policy making, it is also important that they get the support of feminist academics and activists with data, analysis, public support, etc., etc. Many times feminists in policy making fight lonely against very adverse circumstances. So that's a very real comment that was made by one of the participants, and we really need to ensure that we support those in policy making decisions with the necessary data and analytical pieces that they can be able to use to make policy decisions. There was also a question from one of us to Veronica to explain more on indirect tax in a very simple language. Veronica, maybe you'll take that up. Just what's the meaning of an indirect tax in 1 or 2 sentences? And then Wangari, somebody also made an inquiry in regards to the report you mentioned in your report. Is it something that is publicly available, and can we share it with participants? And the last comment that I'll be able to read is on the fact that one of us made a comment that we will only have tax justice one day when we will have women with effective political participation. It is necessary, even we have a training from school in early childhood, so that we get to learn about fiscal policies and tax justice more broadly. So I'd want to open up the floor. If there's any question, please raise up your hand or type on the chat box and I'll be able to read that. I'm not seeing any questions. And I'm not seeing any raised hands. Okay, so 2 questions have just come in. I'll take those and then I'll close the Q&A session because we are running out of time and we need to launch the Framing Feminist Taxation publication. So the first question, what is an example of a feminist advocacy campaign or movement that really excites you in Pakistan? So that question goes to Bilkis. Because of her contextual knowledge of Pakistan and the work that Shirakat does in Pakistan. So please, Bilkis, tell us what is an example of a feminist advocacy campaign or movement that really excites you in Pakistan? And number 2, what are some of the emerging issues in economic justice that will be critical in the next 5 to 10 years for feminists? So Bilkis, in a minute, Veronica as well, please respond to that question in 1 minute. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have several examples, but the one we have really been successful in is, making alliances with media, training them on women's rights issues. And we see, in 20 years, the reporting has, extensively and really, become more sensitive and has improved a lot, particularly in terms of reporting on gender-based violence cases, where they were kind of, initially very, very, flamboyant about this and laughed at the issues of domestic violence. Now it's taken very seriously. And similarly, it's taking very seriously at the law by judiciary, by the government, and by other people. And we have had laws put in place because of women's movement, taking such a strong stance. Over to you.
Thank you, Bilkis. Veronica, the question on indirect taxes.
Sí, los impuestos indirectos son impuestos que se ponen sobre bienes y servicios impuestos que, como por ejemplo el impuesto al valor agregado. Esos impuestos penalizan más a los sectores de menores ingresos porque el 15, el 18%, y no importa si...
Verónica, no podemos escucharte muy bien. Quizás puedes apagar tu video. Carol, I think we may have lost Veronica.
Yes, and I think maybe we'll need to move to the next part of this session today because our time is far much spent. We need to launch the publication, and if we have time towards the end, maybe we can take a couple of more questions, one or two, and we will have those being responded to by our speakers. And the reports that Actionaid International did on the impact of COVID-19 on young women has been posted on the chat box. So you can just click on that link and you'll be able to access that report that Wangari mentioned in her presentation. So at this point, I'd want to share with you some background information about the Framing Feminist Taxation publication that the Tax and Gender Working Group of the Global Alliance has been able to develop together with other partners on describing what a gender responsive taxation looks like. And it has examples from Uganda. So basically the objectives of the publication is that this is a document that really needs to be taken forward by all of us in this room. Let me say so, in this Zoom room, that tax justice movements, gender justice advocates can use it to contribute to changing the tax landscape from a feminist perspective, because it aims to demonstrate how to link a global advocacy issue to a national framework. So we will be able to use it to engage in both domestic policy making spaces as well as other international policy making spaces, like we are doing right now within the CSW, having this very insightful conversation, the financing for development process, and we would thereby really bridge issues to do with illicit financial flows with the national context. But it is also very relevant to the work that we are doing within the global campaign on Make Taxes Work for Women. So with that, I'm really excited that we went through a very rigorous process to put the document together. We had support from Akina wa Afrika, based in Uganda, and Womankind Worldwide, together with members of the Tax and Gender Working Group of the Global Alliance through the Co-Technical Working Group. We had a number of virtual working sessions with them, and we subjected the draft to expert reviewers who are able to input into the draft and to share very valuable feedback that went a long way to improve the quality of the product. And so right now, I'm so excited that we are launching this document today. But just as a caveat, I know all of you will be waiting to have a copy of the document. Sorry to say that the publication is being finalized, and we should be able to share the links to the document when it's ready in the coming days. So to talk more about this publication, I didn't realize my video was off. To talk more about this publication, I'd like to invite Twasiima Bigirwa. She is from Akina wa Afrika, and she will be able to share with us some of the aspects of the guide itself and how we can be able to use it moving forward. So just a brief about Twasiima. Twasiima is the Economic Justice and Climate Action Lead at Akina wa Afrika, and she's a feminist lawyer and writer from Uganda. She has several years of experience working with both national and international organizations on a range of human rights issues, and she currently is at Akina wa Afrika. She serves on the FRIDA Advisory Committee, and she's also on the board of trustees of Womankind Worldwide. She has an LLB from Makerere University and an LLM from Georgetown University Law Center. Twasiima, I hand over the floor to you.
Thank you, Caroline. It's so exciting to actually be able to do this after like months of work that we have put in. And so just to paint a picture about why we thought this was specifically urgent, I think that all the previous speakers have already highlighted the ways in which current tax systems and frameworks do not work for women. But what is critical and urgent is that feminists and women's rights organizations and activists appreciate the ways in which our struggles are all related to tax justice, right? Because who controls the money and how that money is spent ultimately is the reason why we are continuing in this back and forth. You can think about a range of all the rights that you're fighting for and advocating for currently, right? From SRHR to political participation, etc. All of those are still largely tied to who controls the money and how that money is spent. Now, in developing this guide, what we hope to do is to be able, one, to interest and conscientize feminists and women's rights activists, right? By making the language simpler. I think someone else had talked about how we imagine economics to be such a abstract, hard thing. And yet it really just trickles down to how money is spent, at whose detriment, and at whose benefit. So being able to bring a conversation forward in developing this guide that is really as simplified as it possibly could get, but also then having something that we can continuously build solidarity around, right? One of the things that needs to happen is that governments and different, what's the word that I'm looking for? The power holders, right? And that looks at institutions that need to be held accountable, institutions that perpetuate these types of violences, institutions that benefit from this current economic world order. So being able to have a document where we can say, this is what the reimagination can look like. This is how taxes can work, not just for women, right? But making a case for this is how this shift in understanding tax and in applying a feminist intersectional approach to this is how ultimately all of us, our lives are made much better by this. Because we are inherently feminist, it means it's that the ways in which we approached the development of this guide also took into account the different systems of oppression and how they ultimately all work together to affect women, right? And how those manifest in the ways different institutions push, leverage, and ultimately control the different taxation frameworks in our countries and both internationally. Uganda is an interesting case study because I think that the ways in which our government has approached taxation in the past, like many governments perhaps, have seemed to imagine that taxation is gender neutral, right? That the ways in which URA applies taxes affect everybody at the same time. And so the lack of focus on the specific unique circumstances that women and perhaps other minoritized groups experience as a result of these tax policies that are passed sort of without clear context of the ways in which they affect different people in different ways was important for us to highlight. I really don't know what else I can say about the guide, except I'm so excited. It comes out, I think, end of the week, like Caroline had said. And what we hope to do is that we hope to really solidify the movement and solidify the different people who are as invested in this as we are, to one, create, to be able to name and shame what the problem is. But even more than that, to be able to present solutions and present alternatives, because we know this can work, right? Because we're reimagining. And so what the guide is actually doing is it's asking us to collectively reimagine what the alternative can be. So we hope that you shall reference it several times and organize collectively around it. Yeah, I don't know if Karen has anything specific that she wants me to say, but just to say, on behalf of the AMA team, we are excited to carry this conversation forward in Uganda and in the region. And hopefully you shall be attending several of our other feminist recruitment processes where we are, building this movement of people who appreciate why taxation and economics are central to undoing the great injustices that women and minoritized people experience. Thank you. Back to you, Caroline.
Thank you Twasiima for that brief about the feminist taxation framework guide. I see a hand. I don't know whose hand that is. I'm just trying to get back because I'm sharing my screen. Rose, can you tell who has raised her hand up? Who's raised their hand up to say
I'm
something?
trying to see, sorry, I don't see anyone with a raised hand.
Okay, okay. If there's no one, then okay. So if there's no one with their hand up, I think this is what I'm sharing on the screen right now is really what we are looking forward to have on our desks in the coming days in terms of the publication that we have just launched. And as Twasiima has said, this is really an exciting moment for us. And would really want everybody to be able to make use of this particular document in order to advance the work that we are doing in our different corners of the universe. So without much ado, maybe to just some closing remarks for the session, now that we have come to the end. I don't know if there are any questions that we can take up at this point. Anyone with questions or comments that would want to make, please just raise your hand and I'll give you the floor. Okay, if not, we are just about to close this session and we are not going to close it without a chant now that we are in the mood of a global campaign. So I will paste the instructions of how we are going to do the chant on the chat box. So we will have one person leading. Can we all see what I've posted on the chat box? Rose, can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Great, perfect. So I guess all of us can be able to see what's on the chat box. So I will lead the chant, okay? As we close the session, I will lead the chant and then we will be able to wrap up. And before I get to the chant, I just wanted to also mention one important element of work that we've also been doing together with Public Services International on a care manifesto, because one of the demands of the campaign that we are undertaking is that governments need to recognize, to represent, to reduce, to reward care work. And so together with PSI and other partners in the movement, we are calling to rebuild the social organization of care because we are demanding that states resources care as a public good and a collective social responsibilities. Kindly sign on the document, on the manifesto. It is a manifesto that was put together by different actors in the space. So sign on to the document and the link has been shared on the chat box. So back to the chant. I hope we are all together. So I'll ask the question, what do we want? And then please unmute yourself and respond, make taxes work for women now. Kindly everybody this is the time that you can unmute your microphone and respond, make taxes work for women now. And then the next question that I'll ask is, when do we want it? And your answer will be now. All right? Are we together? I'm seeing people still muted. Please unmute your microphone and let us say together. So the question comes, what do we want?
Make taxes work for women.
What do we want?
Make taxes work for women.
Make taxes work
When
for
do we
women.
want it?
Now.
When do we want it?
Now.
Now.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for such a lively session. I think that's all from me. Rose, I don't know if there's anything. If not, then thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Yes, we hope you will join and continue the conversation on social media. Please use the hashtag Make Taxes Work for Women. And also we will be sharing quotes from all our amazing speakers, answering the question, how to move, one action to move towards a feminist tax framework and why it's key for women's rights. So please keep an eye on that, and also on Gatch's website for the guide coming up. And we've really heard that we do need a just feminist economy for all of us around the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Graças a
everyone.
todas. Graças.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Graças. Muito obrigada. Beijos.